The briefing room smelled of cold coffee and printer toner, and Commander Hale stood with his arms folded, staring at the slim woman at the back of the row. He did not bother to lower his voice when he leaned toward his lieutenant and said she did not look like a sniper, that she looked like someone who had wandered in from a library by mistake. The other candidates shifted uncomfortably, but she did not move. She simply kept her eyes on the projected satellite image of the training range, her hands resting quietly in her lap, her breathing slow and even like a metronome no one else could hear. Hale tapped the screen and asked the room which approach lane offered the cleanest line for a designated marksman, and 3 confident voices answered at once. He nodded, ready to move on. When she finally spoke, her tone low and almost apologetic, suggesting that the shadow on the eastern ridge had shifted twice in the last 40 seconds, meaning the wind was rotating, not steady, and that any lane chosen without accounting for it would betray the shooter within a single breath. The room went quiet. Hale stared at the screen, then at her, and something in his jaw tightened. So I want to ask you, the viewer, before we go any further, do you believe the most dangerous strength in a room is sometimes the quietest one? Tell me in the comments. Her name was Sergeant Erin Vale, and long before she ever held a rifle, she was the child in the back of every classroom who noticed which teacher was tired, which student was lying, and which window had a crack that the janitor had not yet reported. Her mother used to joke that Erin did not look at the world, she audited it, and the joke stopped being funny only when people realized how often the girl was right. She grew up in a small coastal town where the fog came in slowly and the boats returned slowly and nothing of importance ever happened in a hurry. Her father, a retired engineer, taught her to fish not by casting but by watching, and he would sit beside her on the dock for hours saying almost nothing, pointing only when the water changed color in a way that meant something was moving beneath it. That stillness shaped her in ways she did not understand until much later. While other children begged for attention, Erin learned that attention was a current that pulled things toward the surface, and that the most interesting truths preferred to stay below. She read books about cartographers, about ornithologists, about the women who tracked weather balloons across the Pacific in the 1940s, and she felt a quiet kinship with all of them. When she enlisted at 20, the recruiter assumed she wanted communications or intelligence, because she scored well on language and pattern tests, and because she had the kind of voice that made people lean in to hear her. But Erin had read every book the base library owned about precision marksmanship, and she had underlined a single sentence in pencil that she carried with her like a relic. A sentence that said the sniper's first weapon is not the rifle, but the willingness to wait longer than anyone else is willing to wait. She did not want the role for the legend of it. She had no interest in being feared, and she did not enjoy the idea of hurting anyone. What drew her was the discipline, the responsibility, the strange moral weight of a job in which the most important decision was almost always the decision not to act. She understood, even before training began, that the rifle was a question, and that the answer was supposed to be no until it absolutely could not be. Her recruiter looked at her for a long moment, and then signed the form. He told her later, over a paper cup of coffee, that he had met people who wanted to be snipers, and he had met people who were already snipers in everything but title, and that she was the second kind. Erin only nodded, because she did not know how to accept a compliment that felt more like a diagnosis, and because she was already thinking about wind. Sniper school did not begin with rifles. It began with notebooks, and with a sergeant named Doss who told the candidates on the first morning that if they could not describe a room they had just walked through, they had no business trying to describe a battlefield. Erin filled 3 notebooks in the first 2 weeks, sketching the angles of doorframes, the color of dust on windowsills, the way light fell through chain-link fences at different hours of the afternoon. Breathing came next, and breathing was harder than anyone expected. Doss made them lie in the grass for hours, learning the natural pause between inhale and exhale, learning to release the trigger inside that pause the way a musician releases a note inside a rest. Erin found that the breath was not a technique but a relationship, a quiet agreement between her body and her intention, and that the rifle simply listened in. Mathematics followed her everywhere. She learned to read mil dots and minute of angle adjustments, to calculate bullet drop across varying altitudes, to factor in humidity, temperature, the Coriolis effect on distances she would likely never shoot. She learned that the round, once it left the barrel, was not really a bullet anymore but a small weather event, and that the shooter's job was to predict the weather inside a second. Camouflage was its own quiet discipline. She learned to build ghillie suits from local vegetation, to crawl across an open field for 6 hours to cover 300 meters, to disappear not by hiding, but by belonging. Doss told them that a sniper who looked like a sniper was already dead, and that the goal was to look like a stump, a shadow, a piece of forgotten ground that no one would ever think to question. Endurance was the part that broke most candidates. Aaron watched stronger soldiers wash out because they could not lie motionless in the cold for 10 hours, because their minds began to scream before their bodies did. She found, to her own surprise, that the stillness she had learned on the dock with her father was a kind of muscle, and that she had been training it her entire life without knowing. But the lesson that stayed with her longest was the one Doss taught on the final week. When he gathered them around a small fire and said that the hardest skill in their profession was not knowing when to shoot, but knowing when not to. He told them about marksmen who had taken shots they should not have taken, and about marksmen who had held their fire for hours while the situation resolved itself without blood. He said the second kind slept better and lived longer and were trusted with the missions that mattered. Erin wrote that down in her notebook in small, careful letters. She underlined it once, then a second time, and then she closed the notebook and listened to the fire. Around her, the other candidates were already talking about their first assignments, about the units they hoped to join, about the missions they imagined. Erin said nothing. She was thinking about the pause between breaths and about how much of a life could fit inside it. Her first unit assignment placed her in a reconnaissance company stationed near a mountainous training corridor, where the air was thin and the wind was honest. The team was small and tightly bonded, and they had been working together for 2 years before she arrived. They had a rhythm of jokes and grievances that she did not yet know how to enter, and she did not try to force her way in. The trouble began on the third day, when Corporal Ruiz asked her at breakfast where she was from, and she answered in a single sentence. He waited for more, and when more did not come, he laughed and called her the librarian, and the nickname stuck in the way nicknames stick when no one bothers to correct them. Erin did not mind the name itself. What she minded was the assumption behind it, the quiet certainty that her silence was something missing rather than something chosen. Sergeant Park, the team leader, was harder to read. He watched her during the first week without comment, the way a foreman watches a new piece of equipment he has not yet decided to trust. He gave her the simplest assignments, the ones a private could have done, and she completed them without complaint, and she made her notes. And she said nothing about the fact that she had already noticed 3 procedural inefficiencies in the team's morning routine. The misunderstanding deepened during their first joint exercise. The team was tasked with a long observation post on a ridgeline, and Erin was assigned the secondary scope. For 9 hours she did not speak, did not shift, did not request a rotation, and when Park finally crawled up to relieve her, he found her exactly as he had left her, her breathing slow, her notebook half filled with terrain sketches and timing notations. He asked her, with an edge in his voice, why she had not radioed in any updates. She answered that nothing had changed, and that she did not believe in filling the channel with the absence of change. Park stared at her for a long moment. Then he crawled back down the ridge and did not speak to her for the rest of the day. The team began to whisper. Some said she was arrogant, that she thought she was above the chatter that bonded the rest of them. Others said she was afraid, that she was hiding behind her quietness because she could not keep up. Ruiz, who was generous by nature, said only that she was hard to know, and that hard-to-know people were sometimes worth the effort and sometimes not. Erin heard most of it. She heard it the way she heard everything, without flinching, without correcting, without offering a defense. She wrote in her notebook that evening that the cost of being misunderstood was not the misunderstanding itself, but the temptation to explain, and that explaining too soon would only confirm whatever the team had already decided. She closed the notebook, and she went to sleep, and she dreamed of fog rolling slowly across a dock she had not seen in 5 years. The mission that changed everything was not, on paper, a mission at all. It was a joint security operation in support of a humanitarian convoy moving through a contested valley, and the team's role was overwatch, nothing more. They were to observe, to report, to remain unseen, and to engage only if civilian lives were in immediate and unmistakable danger. Park briefed them 3 times, emphasizing the third condition with a flat, unhappy voice. They moved into position before dawn, climbing a steep slope under the cover of a thinning night, and they settled into a hide that Erin had helped design from satellite imagery the week before. She had argued, quietly, for a position 50 meters lower than the team's preferred spot, because the higher ground offered a better view but a worse angle on the convoy's blind side. Park had agreed only after she sketched the geometry on a napkin twice. For the first 6 hours, nothing happened. The convoy moved slowly along the valley road, and the team watched, and the radio chatter was minimal. Ruiz made a joke about how this was the most boring overwatch of his career, and someone laughed, and Erin said nothing, because she had noticed, an hour earlier, that a small herd of goats on the far slope had moved twice in directions that did not match the wind. She mentioned it on the channel, briefly, and Park acknowledged it, briefly. The goats moved again. Erin watched the slope above them, and she saw, for less than a second, a flicker of cloth that did not belong to the landscape. She did not call it out immediately. She watched the same spot for 4 more minutes, until she saw the flicker again, in a slightly different position, and then she radioed Park with a single, careful sentence. There were observers above the valley, she said, on the northern slope, not yet moving toward the convoy, but positioned in a way that suggested coordination with someone she could not yet see. Park asked her how confident she was. She said 60%, and she said she would need 10 more minutes to be sure. Park gave her the 10 minutes. In those 10 minutes, Erin did not move. She did not raise her rifle. She tracked the slope with her spotting scope, and she counted the small inconsistencies in the landscape. And she mapped them in her notebook with the same patience she had once used to map the fog rolling across her father's dock. By the end of the 10 minutes, she had identified 4 observation points, 2 of them concealing what appeared to be unarmed scouts, and 1 of them concealing a man with a radio. She reported all of it. Park, to his credit, did not panic. He requested a route change for the convoy, citing unspecified terrain concerns, and the request was approved within 20 minutes. The convoy diverted along an alternate road that Erin had quietly flagged the night before as a contingency. No shots were fired. No one on either side knew, for certain, that anything had happened at all, and that, Erin understood, was exactly what success was supposed to look like. The team came down from the ridge that evening without speaking much, and the silence was different from the silences before. It was not the silence of exhaustion or of routine, but the silence of people who had just realized that something important had taken place without their full understanding of it. Park walked beside Erin for the last kilometer, and he did not ask her any questions, and she did not offer any answers. In the days that followed, the intelligence cell confirmed what Erin had seen. The observers on the northern slope had been spotters for a small element that had been preparing an opportunistic ambush along the original convoy route. An ambush that would have been triggered only if the convoy passed a specific waypoint at a specific time. The route change had quietly dissolved the threat without anyone on either side having to fire a round. Ruiz, who had spent the previous weeks calling her the librarian, came to her one morning with 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from her without asking. He said he had been wrong about her, and that he was not the kind of man who liked being wrong, and that he hoped she would accept the coffee as a partial apology for the time it had taken him to come around. Erin accepted the coffee. She did not say much, but she smiled, and Ruiz seemed to understand that the smile was the full answer. Park was harder. He came to her not with coffee, but with a notebook of his own, a worn green field book that he had been keeping since his first deployment. He sat down beside her at the edge of the camp and asked her to walk him through her decision tree on the ridge, step by step, from the first goat to the final report. He wanted to know, he said, not because he doubted her, but because he wanted to learn. Erin walked him through it. She told him about the wind, and the goats, and the flicker of cloth, and the 4 observation points, and the man with the radio. She told him about the 10 minutes she had requested, and what she had been thinking during each of them, and why she had not raised her rifle even once during the entire encounter. She told him that the rifle had never been the answer, that the rifle was almost never the answer, and that her job was to make sure the answer arrived before the rifle did. Park listened. He did not interrupt. When she was finished, he closed his notebook and looked out across the valley for a long time, and then he said, quietly, that he had served with 3 snipers in his career, and that all of them had been good shooters, and that none of them had been what she was. He did not say what she was. He did not have to. That evening, around the small fire the team kept burning in the cold, Park told the others that they were going to start running their pre-mission briefings differently, that Erin would have the floor whenever she wanted it, and that her silences would be treated, from now on, as a form of communication that the rest of them were going to learn to read. No one objected. Ruiz raised his coffee cup in a small, private toast, and Erin nodded, and the fire kept burning. The change in the team was not loud, because Erin was not loud, and because nothing about her had asked the team to be different. But it was real, and it deepened over the months that followed in ways that none of them would have predicted. Ruiz began carrying a small notebook of his own, and he stopped filling the radio channel with chatter that meant nothing. And he started listening to the spaces between transmissions the way Erin had always listened to them. Park began to consult her on planning, not as a marksman, but as an analyst, and he found that her instincts on terrain, on timing, and on the small human details of an operation were almost always worth a second look. He began to delay decisions by 10 minutes when she asked for them, because he had learned that her 10 minutes were never wasted. He told a visiting major, off the record, that she had become the conscience of the team, and he did not seem embarrassed to use the word. The younger soldiers, the ones who arrived after she had already become a fixture, learned about her in fragments. They heard about the ridge and the goats and the convoy that never knew it had been saved. They heard, more importantly, about the way she carried herself in the chow hall, in the motor pool, in the quiet hours between exercises. They learned that she did not raise her voice, and that her not raising her voice was somehow the loudest thing in the room. One evening, a new private asked her, with the directness of someone who had not yet learned to be careful, whether she ever got tired of being so quiet. Erin thought about the question for a long moment. Then she told him that she was not quiet because she had nothing to say, but because she had learned, slowly, that most words were spent before they were earned, and that she preferred to earn hers. The private nodded, and he never asked again, but he stopped filling his own silences after that. The team came to understand, gradually and without ceremony, that her silence had never been fear and had never been arrogance. It had been control, the kind of control that did not announce itself, the kind of control that lived in the pause between a breath and a decision. They understood that the same control that kept her finger off the trigger was the control that kept her judgment clean, and that the two were not separate disciplines, but the same discipline, practiced over and over until it became a way of being. Hale, the commander who had once doubted her in a briefing room, eventually wrote a recommendation for her promotion in his own handwriting, which was not something he often did. He wrote, in a single sentence near the end, that Sergeant Vale had taught him that the most dangerous strength in a unit was not the loudest one, and that he had spent his career being slightly wrong about that, and that he was grateful to have been corrected before he retired. Erin kept the letter in her notebook, folded in half, behind the page where Doss's old lesson was still underlined twice in pencil. She did not show it to anyone. She did not need to. There is a temptation, when telling a story like Erin's, to reach for the cinematic, to imagine the impossible shot taken from impossible distance, the dramatic stand, the breath held while the world burns. But Erin's story was never that story, and it was never meant to be. Her career, when she finally retired with a chest of quiet ribbons and a folder of letters from people whose lives she had touched, was remembered for the rounds she had not fired far more than for the ones she had. She had learned, in the small classrooms of her childhood and in the colder classrooms of her training, that patience was not a passive virtue, but an active one, and that restraint was not the absence of courage, but its highest form. She had learned that observation was a kind of love, that to truly see a place or a person was to take responsibility for them in a way that could not be undone. She had learned that the rifle was a question, and she had spent her career answering it, almost always, with no. Her greatest strength was never the weapon in her hands. It was the discipline in her mind, the steadiness of her breath, the willingness to wait when waiting was harder than acting. It was the responsibility she carried in her heart, the quiet conviction that every life within her field of view was a life she was obligated to consider before she ever considered the trigger. If her story teaches anything, it is that the quietest people in a room are often the ones holding it together, and that the loudest courage is not always the truest. So when you next find yourself in a room full of voices, listen for the one that has not spoken yet. It may be the one that has been paying attention the longest.